So, of course, the Southerners who owned slaves and didn't want slavery to end, it wasn't necessarily a matter of just their money. Um, there was enough money that to fight this whole war. The money could have been used um, in their mind if they were thinking, they're human slaves are property and they're going to lose their property. That wasn't, the biggest issue. The biggest issue was the loss of a captive labor force that um, could be like systemically oppressed in society, right? It's like they didn't want a disruption of this system of racial inequality and this system of which allowed for a large pool of legally exploitable labor, right, to grow cotton and keep the wealth, in the hands of the wealthy. So, it makes you think like how many lives were lost, how much money was spent um, in defense of the Southerners' rights to continue having slavery. It brought the national debt up considerably. Before the war in 1860, national debt was at about $64 million. And then immediately following after the war in 1866, it was about 2.68 billion, a 40-fold increase um, in terms of national debt. So when the war finally ends, and obviously the South surrenders, and the US wins and there's going to be, a reunification of the North and the South and the movement forward to abolish slavery. A lot of major changes are going to happen, but it goes back to that question of like who gets to decide that slavery is going to end? Is it going to be those who benefited from slavery or those who were enslaved? And so we're going to see that it's going to be those who benefited and who allowed slavery to be legal, they're going to be the ones that decide slavery is no longer legal. And as such, it's not going to be the rights and concern for those who had been enslaved that are going to be centered. When the war is over, it's going to be back to a centering of, you know, bringing the North and South back together, reunifying the country with the same inequalities in place, the same racial oppression in place that had been there. So, looking at immediately after the Civil War ends, um, in the months leading up to the end of the war, it seemed pretty certain that the U.S. was going to win. The Southerners kept fighting, but there was a definite sense that like they were running out of soldiers. You got like kids being enlisted to fight. The U.S. was closing in on a victory and was beginning to plan for what's going to happen once the war ends. How are we going to like go? What's the process going to be for bringing those southern states that had seceded back into the Union? What requirements are there going to be? How are we going to transition out of essentially a U.S. economy, not just a Southern economy, but a whole U.S. economy that had rested upon slavery, right? You're going to have Northern factories that had depended on the cheap cotton from the South, right? You're going to have Southerners who had depended on slave labor for agricultural production. You're going to have a bunch of different industries that had existed off of the transfer, the trade, the insuring, um, the purchasing of human slaves. What's going to happen in all of that, right? So there's all these plans, and then of course, what's going to happen with the anger and the resentment of Southerners who just lost, and now they have to come back into the fold of being American, and legally are no longer going to be able to enslave Black people or are going to be considered in the eyes of the law equal to Black people. How is that going to play out? Right. So Lincoln begins to have plans for Reconstruction. Okay, so how are we going to bring Southern states back that seceded back into the U.S.? So his plan was the states that had seceded, when 10% of the voters, so 10% of the white men in the South, would agree to take a loyalty oath back to the United States, to agree, like, I pledge allegiance back to the United States after having seceded, right? If only 10%, the bar is in the ground, right? It's a very low bar for reuniting the United States. Um, those people who had essentially committed treason and fought against the United States, 90% of them don't have to pledge allegiance to the United States, only 10%. As soon as 10% pledge allegiance, the state can begin to uh, request US funds for rebuilding and get reintegrated back into the United States. Lincoln planned to pardon all of the Confederate soldiers. Anyone who had fought against the United States would be automatically pardoned, except for the highest ranking officers. Like, so those people, those big wigs that were at the top, like the president, the generals, officers in the military, they would not be pardoned because um, it's not like I was just following orders kind of thing. It's like you were giving the orders, you were at the top. Um, and kind of putting it out there, the thing that makes it most apparent that there was not going to be any kind of addressing of racial inequality or the damage that had been done to enslaved people. Lincoln's plan focused on reconciliation and rebuilding the US, not on addressing the harm that had been done by slavery. So very much a focus on, again, the the people that were envisioned as mattering, the people that were, this is the American people, the voters, right? The people who were viewed as full humans under the law. The people that were not viewed as full humans under the law, their well-being, their moving on from these traumas, their integrating into a society, that's secondary. And of course, we're going to see that. And then, people are like, oh, slavery was a long time ago. Yeah, but nothing kind of was really done. And we're going to see that play out in Reconstruction, even though Abraham Lincoln is not going to be there to lead Reconstruction, because 4 days after the Civil War ends, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, right? So he's the first US president to ever be assassinated. And here we have a painting showing the scene of his assassination. Um, so 4 days after the end of the Civil War, Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and another couple, they go to watch a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. A Confederate supporter, a sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, and a group of, and it wasn't an individual action. It was him and a group of other Confederate supporters were angry that they had lost the war, and they had conspired to take out all the heads of U.S. government. So John Wilkes Booth was the one who was going to kill Abraham Lincoln. There was another man who was going to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. Another man was going to kill Secretary of State William Seward, right? So like the heads of the top positions in the executive branch of the U.S. Um, John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln in the head. John Wilkes Booth was an actor, and the play that they went to go see was called My American Cousin. It had been running for a while. It was a very popular play, and he knew the play very well. And he knew there was a scene in the play where every night a really funny joke happened, and the whole crowd would start laughing in the theater. So he waited for that moment when everyone started laughing. That's when he shot Lincoln in the head. So most people in the theater didn't hear it, didn't know what had happened. The people in the booth are like screaming. John Wilkes Booth jumps off the balcony seat where Lincoln has been shot, and he lands on the stage. And he breaks his leg when he lands on the stage. And people in the thing, they're confused. Like people in the audience are like, "Is this part of the show?" They don't know. And then he hobbles off right with his broken leg. And then Mary Todd Lincoln is like screaming like, "Yeah, blah blah blah," right? And there's no um Secret Service at that time. There was a military kind of guard that was supposed to like make sure everything was going to be okay. But once the play started, Lincoln kind of told him, go have a drink, go on break, and he was actually at the saloon next door when this all happened. Um, at the same time, Vice President Andrew Johnson was supposed to be killed, but the guy who was going to go do that, he got cold feet last minute, and he was like, "I don't want to do this," right? And so he didn't. So Andrew Johnson lives. And then Secretary of State William Seward was sleeping in his bed, and he woke up to being stabbed in the chest by another conspirator, stabbed like 14 times in the chest, but he survived. So the only one that gets killed in the whole conspiracy was Lincoln, and he didn't die immediately. A bullet got lodged in his brain, and then he died the next morning. Oops, sorry, he died the next morning. And so with that, the nation was like cheering, the war's over, yay, we're so happy. People were cheering who were against slavery, like, yay, slavery's going to be done. And then the president's dead, and now what's going to happen in the road ahead, right? Well, what's going to happen in the road ahead is that by law, the vice president becomes the president. And so Andrew Johnson, who was supposed to be assassinated as part of this conspiracy and isn't, ascends to the presidency. And then we see that Andrew Johnson's a very markedly different person, Abraham Lincoln, with a very different background. And that's going to very much shape how the US deals with the period after the Civil War and reunification.